So I wrote this book, and there's like 9 chapters on the science, and there's some new science in there, but a lot of it dates back pretty far. Yeah. So, among the researchers at least, studied these sort of basic questions about reading and development. There's a considerable amount of consensus about at least main phenomena. At a certain point or a certain age, you begin to wonder, if the science is so great, how come there's so many poor readers?
Right, yeah, exactly.
Oh, we know.
So, literacy is endangered for many reasons, we know. And so is our commitment to quality education for all.
Right.
Education is under pressure for many reasons that go way beyond any of the science that I'm talking about. Still, that makes me think we need to make the best use of all the tools we have. And if there's science that's relevant and could be incorporated in an effective way, we should do that.
Yes, I like that.
I'll second that.
So my concern, of course, is that we could be doing better. Education is a big field. Every state is different. Districts are different. Your school may differ. And so, the generalizations here are not going to apply everywhere. But if you work in the field long enough and you interact with enough people in enough parts of the country, you see patterns, which are, it's very hard to get the science in the schoolroom door.
Yep.
It's very easy to get pushed away. And even if you want to kind of have some of those bridge building kind of meetings, build projects, it's kind of easy for people to push the science aside. And so I think a lot of good information is being left on the table. Information that could inform better practices, better curricula, if in fact we could get together. And that doesn't happen enough. Maybe it's happening here.
Nope.
But it certainly doesn't happen enough. And, in the book, I tried to make it harder for people to just slough off the research. So I summarized the research. There's 9 chapters that are just about what reading is, how reading works, reading's relationship to speech, children, reading to children, dyslexia, lots of things that we all know and love. And then there's 3 chapters about, okay, well, how does this relate to practices? And that goes into quite a bit of history. Where you begin to see why the cultures of science and education really have been separate for quite a long time. And, the idea is that this disconnection between the science and education, which is even, physically instantiated on lots of campuses where, the education is over here, and the psychology and the communicative sciences is over here, and not to mention linguistics. It makes it really just harder for people who are interested in the same things to even talk. And I think that this has been harmful. It's not the only factor, obviously, in the world, but I do think that, something, some kids are going to learn to read no matter what.
Yep.
And some kids are going to have difficulty no matter what, because they've got a condition that's interfering with their reading and they need special help. There's a big range of kids in the middle for whom what happens in the classroom, before the kid gets to school even, is important. And I think an argument can be made that in many schools, in many parts of the country, and indeed in many English-speaking countries, the practices that people have developed based on beliefs about how children learn and how reading works and language works and so on, make it harder put more kids at risk for reading failure. They either discourage them from reading, or they succeed in learning to read, but then they don't like it. And indeed, takes a lot more effort to succeed, and if we had better practices, maybe more children would succeed. So I think some of the standard assumptions and practices make it harder for children. I think they also makes it harder for teachers. So teachers are not given the tools that would allow them to be successful in the way that they want. Sometimes they're told the science is just irrelevant. Sometimes they're told that, again, your mileage may vary. Sometimes they're told that the only way to learn to teach is on the job, but learning on the job is really hard. And one of the points I try to make in the book is, you know, a lot of the stuff that's going on in reading or thinking, mathematical, arithmetic computation, interesting things, intelligent things we do, we're just seeing the overt results. We're not seeing what's going on in the kid's head. And so if you try to piece together how kids learn to read or how mathematics works or other issues about learning from just an observation, you can learn some things, but there are some things that are not visible to the naked eye. That's why we do the research. So learning on the job isn't great for the teacher, it's not great for the child, and there are things that could be added that would perhaps allow more kids to succeed. So I wrote a book about it, and it came out, you know, in December of last year, so you might not have seen it. We were all thinking about other developments in the country, and I was for sure. The op-ed pages of the newspapers were definitely thinking about other things, and so, you know, it wasn't the greatest timing. So there's this book, and the idea was to make the science somewhat more accessible, to try to shine as bright a light as I could on the history here and how we got where we are. You know, do something eye-opening so that more people, parents, educators, interested parties could, you know a little bit more about what's actually is going on, and also give people some ammunition so that they can't as easily be, you know, pushed away by people saying, well, I'm the professional, I know how to do this, and that thing you read about is just not true. I wanted to make it harder for people to slough it off. It's only a book, but you know, that was the goal. There are some ideas there about possibilities for the future, but I have no great expertise in that area. Certainly, there are things on the horizon that might be good and might be, you know, might undermine the teaching profession even more. But there is some looking forward to what we might do. So this is the controversial slide. You know, this has been going on a long time. Reading scientists have always had this experience of, you know, they do the research and then somebody else does the research and you replicate it in this language and that language and then you kind of write it up in your scientific papers and then somebody writes it up in a document that's a little easier to read and access, and nothing happens. So that's been going on a long time. The thing that finally put me over the edge was, first of all, there were developments in the science that are pretty interesting. The second thing was that I began to see arguments that really, really put me off. So one of them was the argument that the educational system is doing fine, and that the only problem, for example, with reading and math is poverty. So poverty is a huge issue. Poverty has a huge impact on children and education, among other things. There's no question. Economic inequality and disparities have a huge impact on children's success in school and many other things. But the argument seemed to be that until the poverty issue is dealt with, there's not much we can do, because really low achievement is just poor kids, and that's a poverty issue that's outside of education. If you look at everybody else, middle class, upper middle class kids and so on, then you see, well, the education system's working fine. This bothered me a great deal
Yep.
because, who's this education system for? And, the people who are making these analyses of the role of poverty and so on are not the people who actually have to teach the kids from low-income backgrounds. And it seemed to be saying, until you solve that poverty problem, we're not actually going to be able to do much for you. And if you don't have a solution to the poverty problem in your back pocket, then what? You're either abandoning kids or you have to try to double down and make use of, while we're working on those inequalities, make the best use possible of all the tools we have and look at the things that might be more malleable. So I thought this was writing off a whole bunch of kids, and that was really wrong. Low achievement is an economic issue and an educational one, and everyone, a second thing was the science shadowers. So we would do this research and then we'd put it out there in various forms, and then there were these people who would react to it. So you could go to Steve Krashen, or you could go to Allington, or you could go to one of these other people who, there's some study that seems to pretty definitively confirm something that, people had been studying and really seemed pretty decisive finally. And then there would be this commentary which explained it for people in the education world, so that basically saying, move along, there's nothing to see here. And this just undercut the research immediately and allowed people to stay in their comfort zones. A third thing was what was happening with dyslexia. So there is dyslexia denialism. Addington is my favorite. There is no such thing as dyslexia. Dyslexia is an excuse that teachers and educators invented for poor instruction. And if instruction is proper, I can teach any child to read. Well, if you were here yesterday, you heard Ken Pugh's talk. Dyslexia as a category has some uncomfortable, difficult aspects. It's a graded condition. It's not clear. Any cutoffs that you make are going to be arbitrary. It differs in degree. It's caused by multiple factors that differ in degree. And so it's not easy to identify in young kids. We don't have definitive markers. Identifying young kids when it's most important to identify. So it is a difficult thing to deal with. But saying it doesn't exist is not helping. In fact, it just really leads the parents of kids with reading, who are struggling with reading, to be, told that the kid will grow out of it, or they just need to do more work at home.
Just need to be a better parent.
Also, there are all sorts of crackpot cures out there. And then Malcolm Gladwell, who is far more influential than any scientist, in one of his mega popular books, devoted a section of it to dyslexia, in which he entertained the possibility that it was a desirable difficulty.
What?
Pardon? Yeah, David Gladwell. I don't need to publicize his book. I actually went through the section on dyslexia in detail, and it's just classic. We can talk about it if you want, but the evidence was terrible. The conclusions didn't follow from anything he said. It was kind of an interesting idea, and you know something? For parents who are already struggling to get their kids reading or learning or whatever developmental issue recognized, to then be told not to worry, it might be a desirable difficulty, I thought was really wrong.
Yeah.
And of course, this is very influential, and now, I don't know, you folks are in the field. People will say, that's a desire, don't worry about it. It could be, make them really creative and into a Wall Street, mega rich person. That was a terrible argument, and I think harmful to people. Outsourcing. So some kinds of things get outsourced. Learning practice with the multiplication tables. Better do that out of the home. Some kinds of instruction might be better done out of the home. If you thought phonics was important, to be sure, you probably would want to do that out of the home, because you couldn't assume that the school was going to take care of it. And other things. So this seemed to me to be a way to just magnify existing differences in economic circumstances where, there are curricula that are based on a middle class model where there are going to be resources like the ability to hire a tutor or just send your kid to Kumon or there's a parent in the home who's capable of teaching the kid, speaks the language, is at home and not working 2 jobs, etc. So to the extent that some of these essential things, I'm thinking of, preschool through, 5th grade, 6th grade, some of these essential things are just it's assumed that it'll be taken care of outside of the home. I don't think all parents understand that. Certainly, it can work in a discriminatory way against people from low-income backgrounds.
Yeah.
Another thing was the notion that there's like a style of like uncontrolled massive experiments. So, when we do our little experiments on 100 kids, you have to pass through various hoops to make sure that, you're not harming the child, that you've got all the privacy things in place, etc. That there's some value to the research. But, you can bring out a new curriculum or a new teaching strategy because somebody said, this is a great idea and we're going to try this year. And to me, this is really, there's a history of just conducting experiments on millions of kids at a time to see if something works. Again, is that really the ethical thing to do? Shouldn't we be actually not doing, these kinds of, let's figure out if it works by trying it out on a massive scale? Shouldn't we be trying things out on a massive scale when we have some evidence from smaller studies, careful ones, a series of them that suggest that it's likely to work? I just feel like it's not fair to keep pulling out an idea because somebody said, well, let's try this. I hear a lot about morphology now. Let's teach kids to read through morphology, the components of words like prefixes and suffixes and so on. Morphology, it's a much more organized system and you could avoid all those problems with how weird English spelling is. Morphology is worse. It's far more inconsistent than the poor spelling sound system. This is an area I've done a lot of research in. But somebody thought, hey, this is pretty cool. It's different, and what we're doing now is not working so well, so let's try it. This to me is like, it doesn't seem right.
Let's jump on the bandwagon.
There's learning on the job, of course, and just the sense that there are lost opportunities, there's waste, there's more that we could be doing if we were making better use of the science. Now, for this talk, I want to put the shoe for a moment on the other foot. So that was all criticism of education and just things that as they've developed over many decades.
It's all true.
Granting that there are exceptions and the generalizations don't hold everywhere. But you people are entitled to ask, why should I care? I mean, really. I ask myself this. I think there's a lot of science that's actually quite useful and can be it's pretty close to being able to translate into practices. But am I just fiddling, with the small stuff? Is this going to really make a difference for a lot of children, or really should we be putting all of our effort into the huge issues? Safety at the school, nutrition, and, many other things. So I think the scientists owe some clear evidence that what we're doing is relevant and that it's not ready for prime time because, translating the science into really good practices requires a kind of collaboration that doesn't really take place nearly enough.
Yeah.
I've been in those rooms. I've tried to build those bridges. Many other people have too. And we really cannot get past the barriers being people who just don't really think the science has much relevance, they think it's artificial, and they really think that, reading is something you learn to teach literacy now because you're on the front lines. You have experience with children and you see how they learn and how they differ, and that's the way that you succeed. That might also be the way you burn out. It's a very tough thing to try to do. So I do think, though, so I'm not a scientist who says we've got the solution to everything. I'm the scientist who says there's a lot being left on the table that we could make better use of, and it would require, a lot more work. If we all were at least on the same, had the same understanding, then maybe we could do some more creative and effective things. Okay, so I think it is fair to ask, is this science overblown? Much science is overblown, right? There are press releases about science. There are people in the science journalism side who love those flashy new findings that may or may not hold up. We're all buffeted by, contradictory findings that are coming out all the time. And so, who knows, is there something here solid to believe and that I should be paying attention to? So show me. I think that I'll just try to do a couple of examples. I'm not sure of how much time I have.
Oh,
How much time do I have?
45 minutes.
Okay. So what I want to do is just say, I'm not a person who wants to oversell the science as saying, you're just ignoring us, we know what to do. The science doesn't come with the prescriptions for what to do in the classroom. I am very fully aware of how little I know about the additional challenges of teaching in a classroom with N kids. So it is not that the science, here, take this. However, having that those interactions that would make it possible to make use of the science, given all the other considerations, that's worth doing. I just want to give a couple of examples to try to illustrate this. So some of you some of this will overlap a little bit with Ken Pugh from yesterday, but not that much. So the subtext of my book is basically the relationship between reading and speech. And I did a study a really long time ago. So this is the first experiment. I was trained as an experimental psychologist who was studying language, psycholinguistics. And this is the first journal article I published a long time ago. And it was an experiment I did with Mike Tannenhouse, who's a very famous cognitive psychologist now. And here's the experiment. So people come into the lab and they put on a pair of headphones and they hear pairs of words and they have to do a task that any second grader can do or third grader can do, which is decide if the words rhyme. There's a rhyming task, and in contrast to the slide, people just hear things. And there are a variety of different kinds of conditions, but they're represented by these. So some of them were items like clone and stone, they rhyme. Some of them were ones like blown and stone, they rhyme. And then, there's one that don't rhyme, so you're supposed to say no. And there are other conditions eventually. And the finding was that, it's a very strong finding, I have a way on my website to, you can do it at home. It's a very strong effect. You're just listening to these things, you're pressing a button to decide whether it's a rhyme or not a rhyme. We're timing how long it takes you to do this. This is done with college students. They're very good at it. They don't make many errors. But it's harder to decide that these two are to say yes. And the factor that distinguishes these conditions is that these are spelled differently.
Right.
So we had this weird finding. Somehow, when you were listening, there's nothing written in the experiment at all. You're listening, you're just rhyming, and somehow the spelling is penetrating your decision.
Yep.
It's not taking them long, they're going like this to decide. It's quick. So we thought, what does this mean? Somehow the spellings and sounds of these words are very closely linked, to the point where people couldn't help doing this. We set up situations where if people ignored the spelling, they would have performed better. We made all sorts of incentives to try to make it so that if you could suppress this information, you would, because you'd do better in the experiment. People still made these mistakes even when it was not in their best, still were influenced by this property even when it wasn't in their best interests, which said, you know, maybe they can't turn this off. So at that time, people did various experiments on this, and what we could tell was that somehow spelling was influencing the representation of the spoken words. We didn't know exactly how, we didn't have the ways to study the brain, but the effect was clear. Of course, there are many other effects of this sort, right? So if you do your phonemic awareness task with a kid and say split without the p, it's very heavily influenced by their knowledge of spelling. I hope everybody knows this very clever experiment that was done in England. They had kids who are good readers say lamb without the m. And then some of the smart kids said lab. Because the spelling is somehow entering into their decisions, even though it's not a reading experiment. It's just a listening experiment. What does this say? It says that your knowledge of the phonemic, in this case, organization of words, is affected by your knowledge of spelling. We know this from studies of illiterates and so on. So this is a case in which spelling seems to be shaping the representations of sound, speech. So spelling affects spoken language. These are just simple behavioral studies. The opposite is also true. Sound affects spelling and reading. So these are experiments where, these are just demonstrations, but you do experiments with these kinds of things. So you're supposed to read this sentence to yourself. So to get the proper interpretation, you have to say, permit me to demonstrate with a parking permit. The stress pattern here actually changes the meaning of the word. So if you said it got the stress pattern wrong, it would be like, permit me to demonstrate with a parking permit, which is nonsense. So then you do the experiments to see, well, when people are just reading texts for normal sort of comprehension, they're not told what's going on, we've embedded some of these things in the experiment, and we look at, say, eye movements to see, are people spending more time on these words because they have to resolve the stress pattern, which is a property of speech. You can do this with limericks. There are clever studies with limericks. People are reading the limericks. If you violate the limerick, the subject goes boink. There are a variety of ways, it doesn't depend on one method, to show that these properties of phonology, stress patterns on words, syllabic stress, for example, are things that you have to compute, and that indeed skilled readers do compute when they're silently reading just because they do. What's this sentence mean? It depends. It depends how you say it. Fred didn't take the test yesterday. Joe did. Fred didn't take the test yesterday. He tore it up. Fred didn't take the test yesterday. He took it last week. Now, you could say, the sentence will appear in a context that'll make that clear. Yes and no. Sometimes it'll make it clearer. But the person still has to assign the correct stress to the word in the sentence to actually compute its meaning. Its meaning. And indeed, again, you can do experiments that show that people really do this and they have a hard time preventing themselves from doing this. I love your new suit. So when people are reading these things, of course, sometimes they misread this as the word suit, which only will happen if, in fact, you've computed its sound in your mind's ear. You don't have to say it out loud. It's something that you hear somewhere in your mind. So there's many studies of various sorts with different kids and languages and writing systems and so on that all repeatedly show these things, which suggest that spelling and print and sound are really closely integrated, and not only that, you need to have them integrated in order to comprehend a text. So I said reading affects spoken language also affects reading. They're deeply intertwined. Yeah, but maybe this is just because they were experiments, or maybe people caught on, or maybe, you know, the usual kinds of reasonable concerns people have about whether subjects are figuring out what you want. And there are ways to address that, but still, if you're a really die-hard skeptic, you say, this stuff really doesn't relate to the real world. In this case, I think brain evidence has actually been quite useful. So there's a lot of neuroimaging research. Reading is an area that's been, one of the prime ones in which people actually developed the methods and have continued to develop the methods, and it is one of the more advanced areas for this. It's good. I wouldn't have said this 5 years ago, but the methods for collecting and analyzing that data have gotten very good, and it now can tell us things that you can't just see from people's behavior. Sometimes we think, if we just observe the behavior closely enough, or psychologists think, we'll do another experiment and that'll disambiguate the situation. There are some things that are just very difficult to tell apart, only from looking at people's behavior. It's too subtle. The same behavior might have two different underlying causes. So this is a case where the brain research can be useful. It gives you another kind of evidence. So here are a couple of studies. I think Ken talked about these exact ones. So this was a study by a former student of mine who's now a distinguished neuroimaging person at University College London. Basically, he did our rhyming study from a few decades ago, using a method called transcranial magnetic stimulation. Everybody know what this is? It's on YouTube. It's pretty interesting. It's sort of transient voluntary brain damage. It sounds terrible, it's not. There's a magnet. It's in the shape of a figure 8. It generates a small electromagnetic field, and it's held close to the scalp. There are a couple of methods for doing it, but it's a very mild, whatever it does is it results in a mild disruption of processing in the part of the brain over which the thing is being held. The disruptions are not disabling, they're transient, and you can see people going through this on YouTube videos. So what these guys did is they applied this method. Sometimes you apply it to the brain and it actually improves people's performances. It's really surprising. In this case, the finding is really simple. You're doing this rhyming experiment, the person's hearing things. Again, you're wondering if the spelling is having an impact and why. Basically what they found was that if you apply this little interference to a part of the language system that Ken talked about yesterday, it eliminates the spelling effect. People could still tell that words rhymed, but they were no longer affected by the spelling. That didn't happen when, in another condition, they applied the stimulation to someplace irrelevant. What they concluded from this is that the spelling that was causing the effects on speech was actually had structured this part of the brain that is there for speech. In other words, your having become literate has reshaped this part of the spoken language system. So you as a literate person process spoken language differently, comprehend, produce differently than somebody who's not literate. Because for you, your knowledge of spelling, print, has shaped, has warped, has changed your representation of sound. So spelling penetrates the speech area. The exact opposite also occurs. So most of you will have heard of the visual word form area. It's a catchy term for an area in the left hemisphere. It's part of the visual system. And it's been It's been claimed to be, it responds in fMRI studies preferentially to letter strings when you compare it to something like faces or pictures of objects. So it's been called the visual word form area because it's the place where the spellings are stored. And there's a whole evolutionary story about why it ended up there and so on. The corresponding part of the right hemisphere is the so-called face area, which is really elegant results. Left part of the brain, you've got spelling sensitivity. On the right part of the brain, you've got face sensitivity, and now you've got a brain being organized and dividing things up neatly. The face system was supposed to be evolutionary to have evolved in the species, and the spelling area is a cultural thing. That was a lovely story, but it's not true. When you look more closely, you see these areas are not specialized in the way that they are advertised. So you just have, if you only look at a narrow range of conditions, it looks like the face area only responds to faces and the spelling area only responds to spelling. And that's a beautiful story. But then you have to look to the rest of the conditions. Again, this was done by Kathy Price and Joe Devlin in England. And what they found was the so-called spelling areas respond to lots of things. One thing is it responds when people are listening to words. It responds when people have to generate pronunciations for words. Several studies have shown that. So you present a letter string, it activates the spelling area a bit, but it activates the spelling area a lot if you have to, the task is to say the word out loud. So it's very intimately tied with these speech areas that I was just talking about. Spelling is affecting speech, speech is feeding back on spelling. So speech and these things are saying now, you know, we had the behavioral evidence for a long time. People could kind of set that aside. Okay, the brain evidence adds something to this that's important, because you can see that in literate people, spelling and spoken language, written and spoken language, reading and speech are really deeply integrated throughout the brain. It doesn't even make sense to talk about them as though there's a print system and there's a language system. This was a study by one of my favorite hero people, Don Schenkweiler, and other people at Hassan's Labs. Don has been studying older struggling readers for quite a long time. And he and the colleagues at Haskins did a brain imaging study in which they asked the question, how much do the areas of the brain that are processing speech overlap with the areas of the brain that are engaged when a person is reading? And how much does that depend on their reading skill? And the finding is very simple. Higher reading skill is associated with greater overlap. That is to say, when you are more skilled, the areas of the brain that are responsible for print and sound don't just overlap, they're the same areas. And the thought is that that's because they've been shaped by each other. We don't have there aren't any pure areas for speech if you're literate. There aren't any pure areas just for print if you're literate. They've been feeding back on one another, shaping one another over time, and now the marker of progress in reading is the extent to which these two systems have become integrated. I thought that was a very important finding. I'm sure Ken did talk about this. Again, if you just look cross-linguistically at how things work in languages that have very different writing systems, it's the same picture. The areas that are responsible for print and sound overlap to a great extent. There are some, for example, in the early visual system that are really reading specific. There are some that are specific to speech, like when you have to articulate, actually say something. But there's a whole middle part of the system where they're basically working. The same system is being employed. So reading depends on speech. And in the book, for better or worse, I think it's a chapter people really kind of skip over because it's not everybody's cup of tea. What I try to do is trace this back to the origins of writing. We're trying to say that writing is dependent on speech. Human species had speech for untold thousands of years before reading came along. Humans were drawing pictures in the caves in France 30,000 years ago, and that would seem like something that's very close to writing, and yet it takes like 25,000 years more before writing first starts to appear. One of the big hurdles was somebody had to think of the idea of using graphical elements to represent speech. So a horse wouldn't just represent a horse, it would represent the word for horse. This is the big enabling step for reading, and it takes a very long time to be discovered. So in the history of writing systems, the ones that succeeded, the ones that failed, they are the history of how people figured out how a written code could efficiently represent spoken language. It's not a literal record of speech. It doesn't have, for example, word stress in it or intonation patterns. It doesn't have like uptalk kind of things marked in the print. It isn't a literal record of speech. It represents spoken language at a sort of coarser level than that. But it is nonetheless a representation of speech. It is a way to use a finite number of symbols to be able to write down any word in the language. That's what writing systems are, and it took thousands of years to figure this out. So, writing systems, when you look at them, have the property that they are graphical symbols that encode two things: clues to the sounds of words and clues to the meaning. What that means is that when you are reading, you are getting clues to the sounds of words and clues to the meanings of words. That is built into the writing system. It was a really hard-won victory. The two codes are intertwined because of something like this. So this is a simplistic picture, but here's like speech, listening and talking, and here's, seeing letters and writing them, and here's the context, which could be the language context of the text, or it could be the world, things we know about the world. And so we talk about spellings, orthography, and phonology, sort of sound, and we talk about meaning, and you can think of reading and other language tasks as involving these codes. It's a simplistic picture, but it makes the following point. These things are all interconnected. There aren't any pure codes. In fact, these labels are misleading. This is not just phonology. This is phonology as it's been shaped by its use with spelling. This is not just spelling. This is spelling as it's been shaped by its use to determine the meanings and sounds of words. So none of these are actually pure. And indeed, now, many years later, we have the brain tools to be able to see that that's true. If you're wondering, morphology is sort of an integration over all of these things. Okay, so that's about 30 years of research, bits of it, 30 years of research. And the question is, look, if people had been paying attention to this research and taking it seriously along the way, would there actually have been wars about whether you should teach your kids reading is visual, or whether it's guessing, or whether it should emphasize phonology? All these studies are suggesting that what skilled readers have done is dock these systems. And brains are very good at integrating them. There are feedback loops in the brain. It's a byproduct of gaining skill. And I feel like, well, here's some research where if there had been an environment in which it could have been taken seriously, people could have said, oh, there's no reason to fight against that because you're trying to undo something that the brain is actually doing when a person becomes a skilled reader. So to me, this is an area where it doesn't tell you what to do in the classroom. It says, it should give some people background knowledge that says, the goal is for the kid to be able to link these systems. We want to get there as quickly as we can, efficiently as we can, so that they can move on to using reading, to gaining reading skill by being able to read. So that's one case to me that I think is really important, and I use it when people say to me, look, this neuroscience stuff may be fun for you, but it doesn't actually have any implications. I would say here the reading wars are over and science lost. It was a truce. It allowed people to carry on. And indeed, my own school district superintendent said to me, once the door closes on the classroom, I can't control what teachers do, and they're going to just make use of what they know, and basically it was a way to maintain the status quo. Sure. The science didn't actually penetrate much further. That's my experience. Your experience may differ. It's definitely true that many educators, not just teachers, but educators continue to hold and teach erroneous beliefs about speech and reading, and I do think this is one of the things that makes things harder for kids who are starting and unnecessarily place them at risk for failure. Okay, I have a second case if I have time, which is to try to look at something that's not quite as advanced as that, but is pretty close, and indeed might be useful in the near future. So this is a problem that you could call, too much to learn, too little time. And the example I'll use is vocabulary, although it applies to lots of things. So everybody knows that children, now we know, it was ignored for a long time, but now we know children's early language spoken language experience varies a lot, such that by the time children arrive at kindergarten, they already have very different spoken language skills as measured by things like vocabulary, though vocabulary is not the only thing. This, of course, their famous study emphasized socioeconomic status. Later studies showed that it's not just socioeconomic status. There's variability within low SES families. There's variability at other SES levels. You don't want to overgeneralize and say it's just about low-income kids, because it's not. It's a variable. Still, there are kids who are coming in to day one of school who already have weaker knowledge of words of the language. More than that, they could, even if you can pick out the word on a Peabody vocabulary test kind of situation, which you can point to the picture of a pen, there are differences in how much kids associate with that word, how much knowledge is hanging off of the word pen. Chuck Perfetti called this lexical quality. So you have these kids who, in virtue of just their language experience from birth till the start of school, their spoken language knowledge is highly variable. And this weaker knowledge of speech has knock-on effects on many things. Of course, it makes it more difficult to read. Having difficulties with reading, of course, has downstream effects on using reading for other purposes. It's just kids are already behind, and then it's hard to figure out how to catch up. There are, of course, efforts to change parental behavior, try to have them engage more from, their preschool kids with language. We all know there are large-scale projects underway in which people are trying to boost, sort of a language enrichment program. Because it is true that this vocabulary gap is important. And so well-meaning people are attempting to find ways to either prevent it or ameliorate it. I'm not an expert in this field. This is a very difficult thing to accomplish because it's for a variety of reasons. One of which is that the parent's own language may be limited, and just more experience with that language is not really the goal. One major concern I have as an outsider looking at this is buy-in. It is very, very hard to not communicate to these parents who studies say, the language you're using with your kid is more limited. than somebody, middle-class kids or some other kids, and they're not learning as much. It's very hard, and so we're going to do something about that. It is very, very, I'm not one of the affected parties, but it is certainly an issue, I think, how can you convey that message without it seeming like the person's language is defective? And if you are conveying that the person's language is defective, it may be extremely difficult to get anyone to buy in. I just raised that as an issue. I do not have data on that, or there may be solutions to it. Okay, so maybe there are ways to change the environment. There is some science to build on here, and I want to just mention it briefly. So it's what's called statistical learning. It happens with lots of kinds of information. You're engaged in it right now. Basically the idea is this. The world is a place with lots of regularities. Like this room is three-dimensional, and we can be pretty confident that the walls are, 90 degrees and all that. Language has very many regularities in it. That's what makes communication possible. People are engaged in what's now called statistical learning. What it means is that as you're engaged in tasks like looking around the world, or talking, or listening, or reading, you are constantly updating your knowledge of, say, what you're doing. Like, let's stick with reading. When you're reading, you are constantly updating your knowledge of what you're getting from reading, print, meaning, words, etc. When you're listening, you are constantly updating and tuning your representation of speech. You can't help it. It's something that your brain does without you actually flipping a switch. It's one of the things that makes us really smart. We're learning all the time, without effort. So it's called implicit learning. It's picking up information just by engaging in language and so on. It's been pretty well studied. It's unconscious. It doesn't require attention, and it's very similar. In fact, well, the deep learning artificial intelligence, that is gathering so much attention. The principles that they're using there are essentially very similar to what we're talking about. In fact, they were based on research on the human brain. So this kind of statistical learning can be modeled with computational systems that simulate certain aspects of children's speech development. Okay, why does it work? The reason it works is things are interconnected. There's correlations among things. Words overlap in meaning, words overlap in form, visual spaces share certain commonalities, faces share certain kinds of commonalities and differences. The world is a structured place. And what these implicit learning mechanisms are doing is grinding away to find the regularities. That's what makes the world coherent. So how does this relate to the vocabulary issue? Well, here's the puzzle about vocabulary. There are kids who are behind, and there's too little time to teach them all. There are effective methods for teaching vocabulary. I'm thinking of this well back here, but there are others. The problem is they're too time-consuming to really make up a 5,000-word gap. There's just not enough time in the day. Moreover, most of the words that a kid learns are not learned through instruction. They're learned through this engagement in the process and feedback about whether they've succeeded in understanding a text or what someone has said to them. So most of what you're learning is going to rely on experience, exposure, engagement with tasks like reading and language. But there's also the finding that a small amount of instruction, for example, in vocabulary, not only is effective for the words that are taught, but also seems to have further effects on other words. In other words, the idea is that a small amount of vocabulary training, teaching, can be effective, even though it's only a sliver of the words the kid needs to know, because what you learn about one word is influencing other parts of this vast interconnected network. It is your knowledge of words. There are pretty sophisticated analyses of these. You can show it. You can basically, teaching the child certain words prepares the way for words they haven't even seen yet. So what you have is a combination of these implicit and explicit mechanisms. The implicit one is the experience space, has to go on, there has to be a certain amount in the environment for the kid to pick up from. The explicit one is, yeah, we're going to teach you that. And no, we cannot teach everything, but what if we could use our precious instructional time in the optimal way? By which I mean, given the state of the child's knowledge, and given where we think they need to go, which is, a vast network of interconnected facts about, words and their properties. What experience could I give this kid that would not just teach the kid that one thing, but also move that whole structure closer to where it needs to get to? A bigger vocabulary, an adult vocabulary, a fourth grade vocabulary. So what you can say is, I know what the target is. Kid needs to know these things. I have some sense of what the kid already know, but know what the current state of their knowledge is. Now can I calculate on the fly which word, if I taught it to them and it was successful, would have the biggest impact on moving the whole system forward? That would be very cool, because it would mean that not only could you could use instruction a lot more effectively, and there'd be some hope of overcoming what is otherwise seems like a really difficult gap to overcome. Same thing holds in case you're interested for learning about the relationships between print and sound. It's the bane of every teacher who's had to teach phonics that you can only teach a sliver of the system, and nobody knows what the rules are anyway, and really it's just not possible to teach it. It isn't. It's a massively complex network of statistical contingencies. But again, we find that small amounts of instruction is very effective, and now we have a mechanism that explains why. It doesn't just affect the bit that you taught. It has further effects on the rest of this massive network structure. So again, we could, I think, in the near future, be in a situation where we have a sense of where the kid, it's a kind of adaptive learning situation. We have a sense of what the kid's knowledge is. We know roughly where they need to get to, and we can now choose our learning experiences so that they would have the biggest bang. You can't do this with everything. You can do it with things like vocabulary, and spellings, and spelling sound correspondences, and so on, because there's lots of overlap among the parts. This is sounds like magic. How does it work? It's in the science. There is quite a lot of science behind it. I described some of it in the book. And I think it's really another example of where, if we take this into account, it could actually solve a real problem, a couple of real problems. Okay, so just to wind up, I think it's fair to say that the cultures of science and education are pretty deeply estranged. Not everywhere. I don't think that the general problem can be solved by just having a long conversation. Many people have tried that and failed. It's very discouraging. I don't think the solution is a little tweak on how to teach phonics. So the responses to my book were, there's not much here I can really use in the classroom, which is true. It's not got any tip. It doesn't have those kinds of tips. It's trying to say, look, this is the kid's problem. Now, how are we going to get the kid where we want them to go to if you understand what the nature of the problem is, the way reading works, the relations between reading and speech, how people learn, the different types of learning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then we possibly could, that could feed into practices that are effective. So I don't have those solutions because that conversation doesn't take place very often. There are lots of institutional and ideological barriers to this. I personally am appalled by what teachers are taught some places.
Yeah,
Multiple literacies really freaks me out. People seem to think that it's going to obviate the problem of teaching kids to read, but I think kids are going to need to read, and we need to be putting more into it, not less. So I'm not in the front lines the way you are. And the challenge is, if any of this is true, what could we do? And where could you actually bring in more of this science? And maybe get some scientists to volunteer. Thank you. I don't know how we are on time, but I'd be happy to answer questions.
Got about 4 minutes.
Any questions?
I have a question.
I'm going to come down because my hearing is terrible.
Not necessarily a problem, but in code switching, it's situational with a lot of our children. So when you talk about speaking, having a list and coming to the class and having a difference,
Yes.
how is that then? What commonalities will there be to teach that code switch for reading and writing?
Okay, so this is a question. This is one of my.
Where is it?
This is a crucially important question. So if I can rephrase it just slightly. There are certain questions that are understudied, and there are certain populations that are understudied. So we do research on bilingualism. The trouble with bilingualism is the circumstances are so varied. The languages differ, the timing of exposure, how much exposure you get to one or another, all these things are variables that matter. The SES of the people who are the speakers, lots of things, factors there. So it's hard to have a one-size-fits-all prescription there. It's a tough situation. So what I've been working on with collaborators, Julie Washington and others at Georgia State, is a slightly different situation, which is what happens if you speak a quote-unquote non-standard version of English. So you're not bilingual. You are speaking English. But your English is a regional English, or it's an English that is spoken by a group identified by race or ethnicity. We have a lot of these in the US. One of them that's prominent in this study, more than others, is African American English. There's a vast amount of misinformation about the concept of dialect. It's a very difficult concept for people to get. Dialects are just variants of the language. They are not different in terms of their linguistic properties. They are different in terms of their status. That is, which one is chosen for government, business, texts, and so on. Okay. In many respects, a child who is speaking a non-standard, so-called, version of English in the home and community, that kid is doing fine. They have a language. It is just another dialect. It is not remarkable in its linguistic respects. The problem is when they get to school, because the books are written in a different dialect. And that's actually a very confusing situation, because the language, the dialects overlap. They're both English, but they differ enough to be really confusing. You get kind of mixed messages about how does this language work? How do we say this? So the point I make in the book is that this playing field is not level, and moreover, it's an issue the educational system has really not dealt with adequately at all. So imagine the kid, we're looking at their progress through kindergarten and first grade, and we do an assessment at the end of the year. We got one kid who's coming in who's already speaking the dialect that's used in the school and used in the book. They can then just do the usual stuff. They can learn to read, they can learn to do arithmetic, they can learn to get socialized into school, etc. Great. What about a kid who's speaking a different dialect in the home? They got an extra job. They have to manage the differences between the dialects at the the same time, they're supposed to be learning to read, write, and do arithmetic. Now, at the end of the year, everybody's going to be assessed against the same markers. That's not fair, because some of those kids had a longer path to get there than the others, and the assessments do not take that into account. So the first thing is that when people look at achievement gaps, they should recognize that it is not an apples-to-apples comparison. Let's leave aside all of the other confounds there with having to do with opportunity and so on. If you take all of that out of the equation, magically, you would still have a problem, still have a gap, because as long as you compare these kids against the same achievement milestones, you're biased against one of the groups because they had literally more to learn to get to that point. Moreover, they have more overhead in terms of the code switching that you're talking about. They need to learn when the codes are appropriate for use in different contexts and with different people and so on. We've done some research on this. We've done computational models of this. We can actually pin down how much harder it is, for example, to learn how print and sound are related in English when you have two dialects versus one. Now, so my first point is that there needs to be recognition that this is one of the things that is going on, and that has been very difficult to even get. And there are a variety of other non-scientific factors that I think account for this. But let's leave that aside. Let's say everybody suddenly agreed with that analysis. There's a very, very tough decision to make among the affected communities, the speakers of the non-standard dialect. African American English is one, there are others. And they're studied in other countries as well. I always put this research in the broader context. It happens all over the world, and other countries actually deal with these issues much better than we do. But here's America. So there seem to be two possibilities. One is help the kids to become bidialectal. Young children are really great language learners. Use your, pre-K not to teach them math or how to read. Have it as a language experience in the sense of just exposing the child to more of the language that they are going to be encountering when they get to school, so it's not such a whammy when they get there. It does not require extinguishing the child's native dialect. They can be bidialectic. Children can handle that. But it takes more effort. It takes more time. And it could put the kid behind. So one of the things that is not widely recognized about bilingualism is that children who are bilingual, if you test them on either of the languages, they're worse than monolinguals, right? They're splitting their time between the two languages. And so if you look at their vocabulary or other things, and you compare them to monolinguals, they're not as good. Well, of course not. They're learning more. They're learning two languages. Same thing happens with dialect. Kids may be learning a great deal, and they may be on their way to being able to shift between the dialects, which would be helpful. But it takes more time. It takes more effort. Some kids are better at it than others. So, but nonetheless, that's a model that says we should just, it's language enrichment. And I think it has the same problem I just mentioned of buy-in. It is very, very hard to introduce these ideas to parents, to community leaders, and without conveying there's something the matter with their speech. There's nothing the matter with the non-standard dialect. It just doesn't happen to be the one that books are written, or that the teacher is using. It's a social condition. It's not the kid, it's not the community, it's not the dialect, it's just the conditions that exist. Now you can say, sure, just do double, learn both dialects, and then you'll be fine. And that will work if you can get parents and other community leaders to buy in, and we put effort into it. But someone else might say, this is unfair. This is unfair. You are asking me to do twice as much as everyone else, as the middle-class white kid. And that's not fair. That's fundamentally unjust. And so we should, instead of penalizing the child and forcing them to learn this extra stuff, we should just honor their own language, incorporate it into our instruction, and that would be fair. There are obvious problems with that too, which are, for better or worse, the standard, so-called standard version of the English is the one that's used in, got to write papers in that, and it's going to be used in college, and it's going to be used in the job, and so on. So this is not a decision that I personally am empowered to make, but it's a terrible, terrible conflict because there seem to be two equally difficult choices. And for me, having more people understand that this is a choice and there is an issue there to deal with would be a first really important step. We could actually help kids become bidialectal. Yes, you have to put effort into it. If parents are okay with that, go for it. But I can imagine there are theorists who say that's not fair. I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you, Dr. Stein.
Yay.
Steinberg. Thank you.
Good.